When I asked when the wedding was, my daughter-in-law calmly said, "It already happened yesterday." When I lifted the phone to ask my son when the wedding would be, I expected an ordinary answer, something simple I could circle on the calendar and hold close like a small promise. Instead, his wife looked at me as if she had been waiting for this moment. She let the silence stretch, then smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and told me they had already married the day before. She added, as casually as someone commenting on the weather, that they had kept it very small and invited only the people who mattered most. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The words didn't land softly. They hit like cold water poured straight over my shoulders. There was something sharp inside that sentence, something designed to cut without leaving visible bruises. I stood in the center of my own living room, holding the phone with my hand frozen midair, while my son stared past me at a spot on the floor, as if looking anywhere else might erase what had just been said. I had spent months imagining the day. Not because I wanted attention or a spotlight, but because I had convinced myself it was proof that I still belonged in his life. I had saved a small amount each month for a gift, not extravagant, just enough to feel meaningful. I had bought a dress in a color that felt gentle and hopeful, the kind of dress a mother wears when she wants to look proud without stealing focus. I had even bought new shoes, telling myself it mattered to show up looking like someone who was honored to be there. And now there was nowhere to show up. Behind the shock came a quieter realization, one that stung worse than the news itself. I wasn't surprised they married. I was surprised I hadn't been told. I had been useful to them for years, always within reach, always ready to solve whatever problem appeared in front of them. I had paid their rent when they were short, covered groceries when they forgot to budget, replaced furniture when they moved to a better place, and fixed emergencies that always seemed to happen right before a due date. I had called it love. I had trained myself to see it as normal. My son finally spoke, his voice carefully arranged as if he had practiced the line. He said it had been intimate, just paperwork and witnesses, nothing to make a big deal of. But his words didn't match the emptiness I felt, and they didn't match what I saw later when I couldn't stop myself from looking. Photos don't lie the way people do. In bright pictures on social media, I saw his wife's parents standing proudly beside them. I saw siblings clinking glasses. I saw smiles wide enough to make my throat tighten. It wasn't just two witnesses and a quiet moment. It was a celebration with a guest list that had been chosen deliberately. Chosen without me. In the days after, I moved through my house like someone walking through a familiar place that suddenly belonged to someone else. The dress stayed in my closet, still tagged, still clean, still waiting for an occasion that had already passed. I couldn't bring myself to return it. Returning it would have meant admitting the truth out loud, and I wasn't ready to hear my own voice say it. A week after the wedding, the phone rang again. This time, it was her. Her tone was different. No confident smile I could picture behind it, no casual superiority. She sounded rushed, tight, almost frightened. She said their rent was overdue and the landlord was threatening eviction. She asked why I hadn't sent the money yet, as if the payment was something the universe owed them and I was merely the delivery service. I listened without interrupting, feeling something in me settle into place. Not rage. Not even sadness. Something colder than both, something that arrived after too many disappointments, after too many moments of swallowing my feelings and calling it maturity. She finished speaking and waited, expecting the familiar response. An apology, an explanation, a promise that I'd handle it by the end of the day. Instead, I asked her in a calm voice if she remembered what she had said in my living room. I didn't shout it, didn't throw it like a weapon. I simply repeated the idea back to her, as if we were discussing a rule she herself had written. I told her I only help people who treat me like I matter. The line went quiet. In that silence, I heard the shift. For the first time in years, she wasn't in control of the conversation. Her voice returned smaller, confused, and then sweet in the way it always became when she wanted something. She insisted they cared about me, that I was important, that I was family. Family, I realized, was the word they used when they wanted to open my wallet. When I ended the call, I sat on the edge of my bed and let the tears come. But they weren't the tears of heartbreak I had cried before. These were heavy, angry tears that came from recognizing a pattern. I cried for the woman I had been turning myself into, someone who measured her worth in what she could provide, someone who waited for scraps of affection like they were rewards. I thought about the numbers. The monthly rent. The grocery runs. The holiday gifts that kept getting bigger because I thought generosity could buy warmth. The one-time emergency payments that happened again and again. The way my savings had thinned while their lifestyle had grown. That night I didn't sleep much, but by morning, something inside me had tightened into resolve. I made coffee like I always did, but I didn't reach for my phone to check if my son had messaged. I didn't plan my day around their needs. I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out statements, receipts, notes I'd scribbled to remind myself what I'd sent and when. I added it up slowly, line by line, until the total stopped feeling like a number and started feeling like a warning. I stared at the final amount and felt my stomach drop, not because I didn't have the money, but because I understood what I had traded to give it away. I had traded peace. I had traded dignity. I had traded years of my life that I could have spent building something for myself instead of maintaining their comfort. My phone began to ring. First, my son. Then her. Then my son again. The screen lit up with the names I used to answer immediately, the names that used to make my heart race with hope. This time I watched it ring out. When messages arrived, I deleted them without reading them twice. It felt unnatural at first, like writing with the wrong hand. But with every ignored call, I felt a fraction of my spine return. I wasn't punishing them. I was simply stepping out of the role I had been forced into. In the afternoon, I walked outside for no reason other than wanting fresh air. I passed a park where I used to push my son on swings. I remembered his small hands gripping my fingers, his voice calling me the best mom in the world. I wondered when love had become something he demanded instead of something he offered. At the bank, the familiar smell and the polished counters felt like a stage where I had played the same part for years. The manager recognized me instantly and greeted me the way people greet someone they see too often for the same sad reason. I didn't sit down with hesitation. I asked him to cancel every automatic transfer I had set up. He looked at me for a moment, surprised enough to be concerned. He asked gently if everything was okay. I told him I was finally doing what I should have done a long time ago. I asked how to secure my accounts, how to ensure no one else could access anything without my consent. I didn't say my son's name, but the truth sat between us like an unspoken confession. The manager didn't press. He simply nodded and printed the forms. While he processed the changes, my phone buzzed again and again in my handbag. It was like they sensed their supply slipping away. I turned the phone off. I signed the paperwork with a steadiness that surprised me. When I walked out of the bank, the air felt lighter, as if my lungs had more room than they did yesterday. I drove home and noticed cars in my driveway. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. A cold line ran through my chest, not fear exactly, but the awareness that boundaries, once drawn, are tested immediately. They had keys. Of course they did. I had given them keys because I thought trust was the same thing as love. I walked to my front door and opened it. They were inside. My son sat on the couch with his head lowered, looking rehearsed in his misery. His wife paced like someone preparing for a performance. And a man I didn't recognize stood at my dining table with papers spread out like he belonged there. My papers. For a moment, I didn't move. The scene was so wrong it felt unreal, like waking from a bad dream into another bad dream. Then the stranger looked up and smiled in a practiced way. He introduced himself as someone they had brought to help, someone who dealt with family matters and could guide us through a difficult transition. The phrase sounded polite, but I understood what it meant the moment it left his mouth. They weren't here to talk. They were here to take. I didn't raise my voice at first. I didn't need to. I walked straight to my dining table and gathered the scattered documents into a neat stack, as if cleaning up after a rude guest. The man watched me with mild annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. My son's wife tried to step closer, her hands half raised in a gesture that was supposed to look comforting, but I shifted away before she could touch me. I asked, calmly, why a stranger was reading my private paperwork in my home. My son finally lifted his face, and I saw it there. Not guilt, not concern, but panic. He spoke quickly, explaining that they had gone to the bank and discovered the transfers had stopped. He said it was abrupt, that it frightened them, that they thought something might be wrong with me. The words sounded like concern, but they were built from the same material as their usual requests: urgency, entitlement, and the assumption that my resources were theirs. The man in the suit introduced himself again, more formally this time, adding credentials and the name of a firm. He said he specialized in protecting families, that when older relatives began making unusual decisions, it was sometimes necessary to put safeguards in place. He spoke as if he were offering me a seatbelt, as if the danger was my own mind and he was here to keep everyone safe. The phrasing was careful. It had probably worked on other people. My son's wife joined in, softening her voice into something syrupy. She told me stress could do strange things at my age. She said loneliness made people suspicious. She said they worried I was being influenced by outsiders. She glanced around my living room like she expected to find a manipulative neighbor hiding behind the curtains. When she said the word confused, something in me went utterly still. Not because I doubted myself, but because I recognized the strategy. I had seen it before in news stories, whispered conversations, even in my own extended family. When greed needed a respectable mask, it borrowed medical language. It dressed in concern and called it help. It pretended to be protection. I looked at my son and saw him waiting for me to collapse back into the old pattern. If I cried, they could call me unstable. If I yelled, they could call me irrational. If I begged for love, they could call me needy. Every reaction had been accounted for. So I gave them the one response they hadn't planned for. I told them to leave. The stranger started to speak again, still smiling, still controlled. He said they had options. He said families had the right to intervene when they believed someone's judgment was impaired. He said it didn't have to be ugly if we worked together. Then he slid a folder onto my table as if placing a menu in front of me. I didn't open it. I didn't ask what was inside. I didn't need to. I picked it up and dropped it into the trash. The sound was small, just paper landing on paper, but it cracked through the room like thunder. My son's wife stared at me as if she couldn't comprehend what she had seen. My son stood halfway from the couch and froze, his face reddening with something that looked like anger and shame mixed together. She started crying, fast and theatrically, but the tears didn't fool me. I had seen her cry before when plans didn't go her way. She called me cruel. She said they had built their lives expecting my support. She said they had responsibilities, bills, commitments, and that my sudden refusal was reckless. I listened until she ran out of breath. Then I said something that had been true for years but had never been spoken out loud in my house. You planned your life around my money, not around my love. My son tried to step in, adopting a softer tone as if that would fix everything. He admitted they might have handled things badly. He said the wedding had been misunderstood, that it wasn't meant to hurt me. He offered an apology that sounded more like a negotiation. He asked me to be reasonable again. Reasonable. 4 years, reasonable had meant swallowing disrespect because it kept the peace. It had meant financing their choices so they wouldn't be uncomfortable. It had meant accepting scraps of attention because they were better than silence. I told him I wasn't refusing out of confusion. I was refusing because I finally understood. The stranger's smile faded at the edges. He became more direct. He said that if my family believed I was impaired, they could petition the court to appoint someone to manage my finances. He said it could be my son. He said it could be temporary, until I felt better. He spoke as if he were describing a simple administrative process, as if my autonomy were a switch someone else could flip. My son's wife stopped crying and looked at me with sudden cold honesty. She said everything I had would be theirs someday anyway. She said they were only trying to make things easier, faster, more efficient. She said it was like the conclusion of an argument that had been happening in their minds for years. At that moment, I saw what I had refused to see for too long. They weren't afraid for me. They were afraid of losing access. I pointed at the door and repeated myself. Leave. My son's face twisted, and he said something meant to frighten me. He said I would end up alone. He said I would regret pushing them away. He said no one would care for me when I truly needed help. I felt sadness then, sharp and clean, because I understood the truth buried inside his threat. He wasn't promising care. He was promising punishment. I told him the loneliness he described had already existed. I had been lonely while funding their life. I had been lonely while waiting for calls that only came with demands. The only difference now was that I was choosing my solitude instead of begging for companionship. They left with the offended posture of people who think the world has violated them by refusing to obey. The stranger gathered his papers quickly, irritated, and warned again that this wasn't over. My son's wife shot me a look that wasn't grief at all but hatred sharpened by desperation. When the door closed, my house fell silent. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt clean. That night, I didn't sleep, but not because I was broken. My mind moved like a machine that had been switched on after years of idling. I made plans. Practical plans. The kind of plans you make when you stop wishing and start protecting yourself. In the morning, I called an attorney I trusted, someone my late husband had once used when we handled wills and property. When I sat across from him in his office, I told the story without embellishment. I told it in the plain language of facts. Money given, transfers made, boundaries set, retaliation attempted. He didn't look surprised. He told me the name for what they were doing. He called it exploitation. He said it happened more often than people wanted to admit. He said the most dangerous abusers were the ones who could wear the costume of family. He advised me to document everything, from payments to messages to surprise visits. He advised me to secure my finances and update my legal paperwork. He advised me to change locks and treat my home like the property it was, not the communal resource my son believed it to be. When we reviewed the numbers together, his eyebrows rose. He didn't shame me for it, but he didn't soften it either. He told me, gently but clearly, that my generosity had funded an entire adult lifestyle. He told me that if this reached court, records would be my shield. I left his office with a folder of my own, this one filled with protection, not surrender. On the way home, I stopped at a hardware store and bought new locks. The cashier recognized me and asked if my son had another emergency. I told him it was for my house, for my safety, for my peace. He nodded in a way that suggested he understood more than he said. By the time I got home, I had done something more important than changing a bank transfer. I had changed the role I played in my own life. And I knew, with a certainty that made my hands steady, that my son and his wife would not accept that change quietly. The next day, the locksmith's van pulled up in front of my house just after sunrise, and for a moment I felt a strange embarrassment, as if protecting myself was something to be ashamed of. Then I remembered the sight of my private papers spread across my dining table, the man in the suit smiling like he belonged there, and the embarrassment burned away into something steadier. The locksmith introduced himself politely, asked which doors I wanted rekeyed, and worked with calm efficiency, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Maybe it was. Maybe what was truly abnormal was how long I had lived without boundaries. When he handed me the new keys, they felt heavier than their actual weight. Not because of the metal, but because they represented a decision that couldn't be undone with a single guilty phone call. The old keys my son and his wife carried would now be useless. 4 years, that thought would have filled me with anxiety. Now it brought relief sharp enough to make my eyes sting. Before the locksmith even left my driveway, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Then another. Unknown. Then my son's name, flashing like a warning light. I didn't answer any of them. I watched the screen go dark and set the phone face down on the counter as if it were an object that no longer deserved my attention. I had told myself I would stop reacting and start acting. So I acted. I called the security installer the hardware store owner had recommended and scheduled cameras for the front and back of the house. I called my bank again and asked about extra protections, not the kind you set up for casual fraud, but the kind you set up when the threat is wearing your family's face. I asked about alerts, about new account numbers, about whether anyone could try to impersonate me in person. The representative's voice became more serious as she listened, and she guided me through steps I hadn't known existed. Every click of confirmation felt like closing a door that had been left open for thieves who never had to pick a lock. Then, after the practical calls were made, I did something that felt almost rebellious. I left the house for no reason other than wanting to. I drove to a small cafe I had passed 1,000 times but never entered because my days were always arranged around other people's needs. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching strangers move through their ordinary lives. It struck me how peaceful the world could be when you weren't constantly bracing for the next crisis. I tried to focus on the warmth of the cup, the sound of spoons tapping ceramic, the quiet murmur of conversation. But my mind kept circling back to one question. How far would they go? My son had grown up in this house. He had learned to ride a bicycle in the driveway, scraped his knees on the sidewalk, cried in my arms over childhood heartbreaks I can barely remember now. And yet he had stood in my living room while a stranger suggested taking control of my finances. And he hadn't stopped it. He had helped orchestrate it. In the cafe's reflective window, I caught a glimpse of myself and barely recognized the woman sitting there. She looked older than I remembered, not because of wrinkles, but because of the way exhaustion had settled into her posture. The thought came suddenly and clearly. I am tired of being afraid. By the time I returned home, the sunlight had shifted across my floors. The house felt different with the new locks, as if it belonged to me again. I had just set down my purse when the doorbell rang. The new camera wasn't installed yet, but I still had a peephole. I looked through it and saw my son standing on the porch, his wife behind him, and another man with a folder tucked under his arm. Not the same man from before, but someone cut from the same cloth. My stomach clenched, but I didn't open the door. I didn't even speak at first. I stood there in silence, listening. My son knocked again, harder. His wife's voice rose, sharp and impatient, calling my name as if summoning a servant. The man in the background murmured something I couldn't hear. Then my son's voice softened, adopting a tone that was supposed to sound concerned, the tone people use when they want to appear reasonable to an audience. He said they needed to talk, that this was urgent, that I was making a mistake. I stayed still. 4 years, urgency had been the lever they pulled to move me. A late fee, an angry landlord, a misunderstanding, a sudden expense that just couldn't wait. Urgency always made me surrender before I could think. Now, I let it bounce off the door like rain. When I didn't respond, my son tried a different tactic. He spoke louder, as if explaining something to the neighbors. He said he was worried about me, that I had been acting strangely, that he needed to make sure I was safe. His wife chimed in, describing me as confused, isolated, emotional. She used words like episodes and decline, the same vocabulary designed to make other people look at me with pity instead of respect. A hot flush climbed my neck. They were building a story in public. They were laying the groundwork. I stepped away from the door and called my attorney. His assistant answered first, brisk and calm, and within minutes he was on the line. When I told him what was happening, he didn't sound surprised. He told me not to open the door. He told me to stay inside and let him handle it. He asked if they were threatening entry. I said I didn't know. Then I heard it. Metal scraping against metal. A key turning in the lock. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The old key, the one they had used freely for years, slid into the lock out of habit or entitlement, and I heard it catch but not turn. The new lock was held. The sound was small, but it was the sound of a boundary doing its job. My son knocked again, then tried the handle. When it didn't open, his wife's voice rose in anger, sharp enough to carry through the door. She accused me of shutting them out, of being cruel, of forgetting who my family was. My family. The word is different now. It didn't feel warm. It felt like a claim of ownership. My attorney told me to stay quiet and hang up so he could make calls. I did. I set my phone down and stood in my hallway, heart pounding. For a moment, I thought of calling out that I would not be manipulated again. But I stopped myself. Words had always been my weakness, because words gave them something to twist. Silence was cleaner. Silence didn't provide material for their performance. After several minutes, the knocking stopped. I listened for the sound of footsteps leaving, the murmur of voices fading away. Instead, I heard my son speak again, but now his voice had that edge of threat he had shown the day he left my house. He said this would get worse if I didn't cooperate. He said they would have to do things properly. He said he didn't want to, but he would. The message underneath his words was unmistakable. If I wouldn't open my wallet voluntarily, they would try to pry it open legally. When their voices finally moved off the porch, I didn't feel victorious. I felt sick. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I understood how far they were willing to go. 2 days later, the security system was installed. Cameras perched above the door like silent witnesses, and when I opened the monitoring app on my phone and saw the clean view of my driveway, something in my chest loosened. It wasn't paranoia to protect yourself after someone has proven they will violate you. It was prudence. That afternoon, I went to see my sister. We hadn't lived in the same city in years, and we spoke less often than we should have. The truth was, every conversation with her eventually became a report on my son's life. I had always framed my financial help as generosity I was proud of, as proof I was a good mother. My sister had listened, but there had always been a quiet pause in her responses that I had chosen not to interpret. When I sat across from her at her kitchen table, the familiar scent of her home hit me with unexpected emotion. It smelled like soup and lemon cleaner, like an ordinary life. She poured tea and waited. Her eyes studied my face as if reading a chapter she had been waiting years to hear. I told her everything. I told her about the secret wedding, about the phrase that sliced through me, about the rent call a week later, and about the visit to my house with a stranger and a folder meant to steal my autonomy. I told her the amounts I had given, the way my savings had thinned, the way my son had become someone who looked at me with calculation. I told her how they were now trying to build a narrative that I was unstable. My sister listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her cup down and exhaled slowly, as if releasing anger she had carried quietly for a long time. Then she said, in a voice that wasn't harsh but was firm, that she was not surprised. The words stung, but they also rang true. She told me she had seen it at family gatherings, the way my son spoke about me. Not with affection. Not with gratitude. With expectation. He would mention what I paid, what I bought, what I covered, as if those were details of a service contract rather than gestures of love. His wife would smile while speaking about my future, about how one day things would be easier, as if she were discussing a timeline that ended with my absence. Hearing it from someone else felt like stepping into cold water. I had suspected, but suspicion is a soft thing you can argue with. Confirmation is solid. It leaves no room for the comforting lies you tell yourself. I drove home with my hands trembling on the steering wheel, not from fear but from grief. Grief for the version of motherhood I thought I was living. Grief for the years I had tried to buy closeness. Grief for the boy I remembered and the man who had replaced him. When I pulled into my driveway, the camera feed showed my porch empty. For a moment, relief swept over me. Then I saw movement at the edge of the screen. A car rolled slowly past my house, my son's car, his wife in the passenger seat. They didn't stop. They just passed, like predators circling, like people memorizing a routine. That night, I started a notebook. I wrote down dates and times. I wrote down the calls, the texts, the unexpected visits. I wrote down the phrases they used. I wrote down what they demanded. It felt strange to document my own family the way you document a threat, but the act of writing it made the situation real in a way that forced my mind to accept what my heart still wanted to deny. The next morning, a woman knocked on my door. Through the camera feed, she looked professional, neatly dressed, holding a folder. When I opened the door with the chain still latched, she introduced herself as someone from a local senior services office. She said they had received a report that I might be at risk, and they needed to conduct a wellness check. My mouth went dry. My son and his wife had moved beyond private manipulation. They had brought in authorities. They were using the system as a weapon. I asked for identification. She presented it quickly, as if she expected resistance and was prepared to counter it with legitimacy. The card looked real. Her voice was calm, practiced, not cruel. She was doing a job. But her presence in my home, triggered by my son's accusation, felt like an intrusion almost as violating as the strangers reading my papers. I let her in, because I knew refusing could be twisted into evidence. Inside, she sat on my sofa with her folder open and her pen poised. She asked questions in a structured way, the way professionals do when they are trained to sound neutral. She asked about my daily routine, my health, my finances, my relationships. She asked if anyone was pressuring me. She asked if I felt unsafe. Then she asked, delicately, why I had changed my financial behavior so suddenly. My heart thumped hard, but my mind stayed clear. I told her I would not answer without my attorney present. Her expression tightened slightly. She said this was not a legal interrogation, that it was a simple check, that cooperation would make everything smoother. She said people who had nothing to hide usually didn't need lawyers. The phrase made anger flare in my chest. It was the same logic used to strip people of rights. It was the same logic my son and his wife relied on. If you object, you must be guilty. I didn't argue. I simply repeated that I wanted my attorney. When my attorney arrived, his presence changed the air in the room. He greeted the woman politely, reviewed her credentials, and then, without raising his voice, began to reframe the story. With facts. He described the attempted power of attorney pressure. He described the unauthorized access to my private documents. He described the pattern of financial dependence and manipulation. He placed bank statements and records on the table, not dramatically, just firmly, as if laying down a foundation that could not be moved. The woman's eyes shifted from my face to the paperwork and back again. Her professional neutrality didn't disappear, but I could see her recalibrating, the way people do when they realize they were handed a distorted narrative. She asked me again why I had stopped paying. I told her the truth in plain language. I told her I had been funding two capable adults for years. I told her they had excluded me from their lives except when they needed money. I told her they had attempted to paint my boundaries as mental decline. I told her I was not confused. I was finally awake. She asked whether I managed my own affairs. I told her yes. I told her I paid my bills on time. I maintained my home. I drove safely. I kept appointments. I ate well. I had friends and neighbors who checked on me. I had legal representation because my family's behavior had forced me to protect myself. My attorney asked her quietly whether it was normal for a man in his 30s to rely on his elderly mother for rent. The woman's pen paused. After a final set of questions, she closed her folder. She said she saw no evidence that I was at risk. She said she would close the case unless new information emerged. She stood, thanked us, and left. When the door shut behind her, the house felt too quiet again, but not peaceful this time. The quiet carried a warning. My son and his wife had proven they would escalate whenever they were blocked. They would keep pushing until something cracked, and they hoped the thing that cracked would be me. My attorney didn't sugarcoat it. He told me that next, they could try for guardianship in court. He told me it would be expensive for them and difficult to win, but not impossible if they found the right combination of sympathetic ears and manufactured evidence. He told me that the best defense was preparation, documentation, medical evaluation if needed, and witnesses who could speak to my competence. That evening, as the sun went down, I sat in my living room and watched the camera feed on my phone. Headlights moved in the distance. A car slowed near my house, then continued. Another slowed. My stomach tightened each time, not because I thought they would break in now that the locks were changed, but because I realized they weren't acting like family anymore. They were acting like adversaries gathering information. I went to bed with the notebook beside me, and in the dark I felt grief and anger entwined, but beneath both was something steadier than either. If they wanted a fight, they would not find the frightened, pleading woman they expected. They would find someone who had finally learned that protecting herself was not cruelty. It was survival. The weeks that followed felt unreal, as if I had stepped into a version of my life I had never rehearsed for. I woke each morning with a knot in my stomach, not knowing what new escalation might arrive, but alongside the fear there was something unfamiliar and strong. Resolve. I was no longer reacting blindly. Every step I took was deliberate, measured, and documented. My attorney advised me to undergo a voluntary mental and cognitive evaluation before my son and his wife could force the issue. At first, the idea offended me. I had lived independently for decades, managed my finances without error, raised a child alone, and survived grief and loss without losing my footing. The idea that I needed to prove my sanity felt like another humiliation. But then I understood the strategy. This wasn't about dignity anymore. It was about protection. The evaluation took several hours. The doctor was calm, professional, and kind in a way that didn't feel patronizing. She asked me questions about my daily routines, my memory, and my reasoning. She asked me to solve simple and complex problems, to recall sequences, to explain financial decisions I had made recently and why. I answered slowly, carefully, not because I was confused, but because I wanted every word to land exactly where it should. When she finished, she smiled and told me my cognitive function was excellent for my age. Better than average, she added, with genuine surprise. She explained that stress and emotional trauma could make people appear unstable from the outside, but that my decision-making was rational, consistent, and well-founded. She wrote her report the same day and sent it directly to my attorney. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because I needed her approval, but because her words dismantled the narrative my son and his wife were trying to build. They could accuse me of cruelty. They could accuse me of stubbornness. But they could no longer credibly accuse me of incompetence. Still, the attacks didn't stop. Cars continued to pass my house slowly. Unknown numbers kept appearing on my phone, sometimes leaving voicemails filled with anger, sometimes with forced tenderness. My son alternated between threats and apologies, between blaming me and begging me to fix this. His wife's messages were colder, more strategic. She spoke of legal consequences, of obligations, of how unfair I was being after all they had invested emotionally in me. What struck me most was that not one message asked how I was doing. Not one asked if I was safe, healthy, or at peace. They only asked when I would give in. In the middle of all this, an unexpected kindness entered my life. My neighbor, an older woman I had only exchanged polite greetings with over the years, knocked on my door one afternoon carrying a mug of coffee. She said she had heard raised voices weeks earlier and had been worried. Her concern was genuine, uncomplicated, and it caught me off guard. I invited her in. Over coffee at my kitchen table, I told her everything. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften the truth. I told her about the money, the wedding, the lawyers, the accusations. She listened quietly, her hands wrapped around the mug, nodding slowly. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said something that stayed with me long after she left. I went through the same thing with my daughter, she said. Different details. Same pattern. She told me how she had supported her adult child for years, believing it was temporary, believing love would eventually replace dependence. She told me how the demands grew, how gratitude disappeared, how boundaries were met with rage. When she finally said no, her daughter accused her of being selfish, unstable, heartless. The words were different, but the intention was identical. What happened? I asked. It was ugly at first, she said honestly. I cried every day. I felt like I had failed as a mother. But eventually, something changed. She had to take responsibility for her life. And I got my dignity back. Her story didn't promise reconciliation. It didn't guarantee a happy ending, but it offered something more realistic: survival with self-respect. For the first time since all this began, I felt less alone. Encouraged by that conversation, I began to rebuild parts of my life I had neglected for years. I visited the salon and let someone care for me instead of the other way around. I reconnected with hobbies I had abandoned because they felt selfish. I started painting again, slowly at first, my hands stiff and unsure, then with growing confidence as colors filled the canvas. Every small act of self-care felt like reclaiming territory that had been quietly occupied. But the calm didn't last. One morning, my attorney arrived at my house with a grave expression and a thick envelope. Inside were court papers. My son and his wife had formally filed a petition seeking to have me declared mentally incompetent and requesting legal guardianship over my affairs. The words blurred on the page as my heart pounded. I had known this was possible. I had prepared for it intellectually, but seeing it in black and white was different. This wasn't a threat anymore. It was an attack. They had gathered statements from people willing to describe my behavior as erratic. A neighbor who disliked me. A professional they had misled. Selective interpretations of my refusal to cooperate with them framed as paranoia. They had built a case designed not to tell the truth, but to sound convincing. I sat down heavily, the weight of betrayal pressing into my chest. This was no longer about money alone. This was about control. About power. About erasing my autonomy entirely. My attorney didn't waste time. He told me we would fight. He explained the process, the burden of proof, the importance of witnesses. He reminded me that their case was built on distortions, while ours would be built on evidence. Medical evaluations. Financial records. Testimony from people who knew me as I was now, not as they wanted me to appear. Still, when he left, I cried. I cried for the son I had loved unconditionally. I cried for the years I had sacrificed believing they would come back to me as gratitude. I cried for the realization that there was no path back to the relationship I had imagined. No apology could erase this. No reconciliation could undo the fact that my own child was willing to strip me of my rights to fund his comfort. When the tears stopped, something hardened inside me. If they wanted to take this to court, I would not shrink. I gathered my documents, organized my records, and met with my attorney again to prepare. Friends I had made recently offered to testify on my behalf. Neighbors who had seen me thrive since setting boundaries volunteered statements. The doctor who evaluated me agreed to appear if necessary. The contrast was stark. On one side, accusations built from resentment and greed. On the other, proof is built from consistency and clarity. The night before the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. I looked older than I once had, but I also looked stronger. My posture was straighter. My eyes are clearer. This was not the face of a woman who had lost her mind. It was the face of a woman who had found it again. Whatever happened in that courtroom, one truth was already undeniable. I was no longer willing to disappear so others could live comfortably. And I would not surrender my life quietly. The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. I woke before dawn, my mind already alert, my body moving with a quiet determination I hadn't felt in years. There was no panic this time, no frantic pacing, no bargaining with fate. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel grounded and dignified, not because appearances decide the truth, but because I wanted to look like the woman I knew myself to be. When my attorney arrived, he reviewed our strategy one last time, but there was little left to say. The evidence was organized. The witnesses were ready. The evaluations were complete. What remained was endurance. The courthouse was colder than I expected, both in temperature and atmosphere. Its long corridors echoed with footsteps and murmured conversations, and as I walked beside my attorney, I felt the weight of everything that had led me here. Years of love, years of sacrifice, years of silence. All of it condensed into this single moment where my right to exist as an independent human being would be examined. I saw my son before he saw me. He stood near a bench, dressed sharply, his posture tense. His wife was beside him, dressed in dark colors, her expression composed in a way that felt rehearsed. When our eyes met, he looked away. She did not. Her gaze held no warmth, no uncertainty. It was the look of someone who had already decided how this story should end. Inside the courtroom, everything moved with formal precision. The judge entered, the case was called, and suddenly my life was no longer mine alone. It was a subject, a file, a question mark. Their attorney spoke first. He painted a picture of concern and confusion, of a mother who had suddenly changed, who had withdrawn, who had made irrational decisions under the influence of outsiders. He spoke of fear, of responsibility, of love disguised as alarm. If someone had walked in without context, they might have believed him. But context is everything. When my attorney stood, his voice was calm and steady. He did not attack. He did not dramatize. He laid out facts like stones placed one by one into a foundation. Financial records showing years of support. Messages demonstrating a pattern of contact only when money was involved. Documentation of unauthorized entry into my home. Evidence of attempted coercion to sign away control. Witnesses were called. My son's wife testified first. Her voice trembled as she spoke of worry and heartbreak, of watching me change. She spoke of love, of wanting what was best for me. When questioned, however, her story began to fray. Dates blurred. Examples became vague. When asked when she last contacted me without requesting money, she could not answer. When asked why I had not been invited to the wedding, she spoke in circles. My son testified next. Hearing his voice describe me as unstable was one of the most painful moments of my life. But pain did not mean weakness. When questioned about the money he had received, about his financial independence, about his attempts to gain control over my accounts, his answers lost confidence. The courtroom heard not a worried child, but an adult unwilling to accept responsibility. The witnesses they had brought were weak. Observations without context. Opinions without evidence. Claims built on assumptions. Then it was our turn. The doctor who evaluated me testified with clarity and authority. She explained the tests, the results, the conclusions. She stated plainly that I was mentally competent, cognitively strong, and fully capable of managing my affairs. There was no hesitation in her voice. Friends and neighbors testified next. They spoke of my daily routines, my independence, my engagement with life. They described a woman who was not declining, but emerging. Someone who had grown stronger after setting boundaries, not weaker. Finally, I was called to testify. I walked to the stand with my back straight and my head high. I did not rush. I did not apologize for taking up space. When I spoke slowly, carefully, choosing honesty over performance. I told the court about the years of financial support. I told them about the wedding I wasn't invited to. I told them about the phrase that changed everything, about being told I wasn't special enough. I explained how that moment forced me to see my relationship with my son and his wife clearly for the first time. I said that stopping financial support was not an act of confusion or revenge. It was an act of self-preservation. I said that love should never require the surrender of dignity, autonomy, or safety. I said that I had raised my son to be independent, and that I believed he was capable of supporting himself, even if he didn't want to. When asked if I regretted my decision, I answered truthfully. I regretted waiting so long. The judge listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the final arguments were made, the courtroom fell silent as he left to deliberate. Minutes stretched into an hour. Every sound felt amplified. I focused on my breathing, reminding myself that no matter the outcome, I had spoken my truth. When the judge returned, everyone stood. His ruling was clear. He found no evidence of mental incompetence. He stated that my decisions were rational, informed, and legally protected. He noted that the petition appeared motivated by financial interest rather than genuine concern. He denied the request for guardianship in full. The words settled over me like sunlight after a storm. It was over. As people began to leave, I remained seated for a moment, letting the reality sink in. My attorney placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I didn't look at my son or his wife as they walked past me. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks that followed, my life changed quietly but completely. I sold my house, not because I was running, but because I wanted a fresh beginning untainted by memories of fear. I moved into a smaller place that felt bright and manageable. I donated part of my savings to organizations that protected others from the kind of abuse I had survived. I traveled. I painted. I laughed with people who valued my presence, not my wallet. I never heard from my son again. I heard through others that he and his wife had struggled, that they were forced to adjust their lifestyle, that they finally had to stand on their own. I felt no satisfaction in that knowledge. Only closure. Some evenings, I sit by my window and think about the woman I used to be, the one who believed love had to be earned with sacrifice. I wish I could reach back and tell her that love does not demand self-erasure, that generosity without boundaries is not kindness, and that it is never too late to choose yourself. I am older now. I am quieter. But I am free. And that freedom, I have learned, is worth everything.